Measurement validity is different than research design validity. Research design validity is looking at whether how I set up my experiment and how I implemented it and carried it out, how I analyzed the results, are those giving me valid conclusions? Measurement validity is much narrower. Here we're looking at, is my outcome measure an accurate measure of what I'm interested in? And validity is measured relative to the specific purpose and population you want to use it for. So I can use a tape measure to measure the circumference of my head. And if I'm using that measurement to get my hat size, that's a valid measure for my hat size. If I'm using it to measure IQ, that is not a valid measure of intelligence. There are several different types of measurement validity. The weakest are face validity and content validity. The strongest is criterion validity. We can measure something's criterion validity if we've got some sort of gold standard to compare it to. In between is something called construct validity. Face validity is essentially, does my measure pass the sniff test? To assess face validity, we show our outcome measure to a group of experts and ask them if it looks okay. Content validity is looking at whether a measure captures all the pieces of some complex construct. For example, quality of life. So there's lots of things that can go into someone's quality of life. The extent that my measure captures all of those parts of someone's quality of life is its content validity. And you may see reference to a statistic called the content validity index of a measure. That's what that measure is referring to. Content validity is different than internal consistency, which is a type of reliability. Internal consistency is looking at whether all the questions in this measure are measuring the same thing. So the internal consistency of a measure for quality of life is measuring whether all of the questions relate to quality of life. Content validity is looking at that same measure and asking to what extent all the questions cover all the important parts of quality of life. If we have a gold standard that we can compare our outcome measure to, we can establish criterion validity. If we don't have a gold standard, so if we're measuring something that isn't easy to directly measure or see, then we need to establish construct validity. So for things like pain or motivation, intelligence, quality of life, these things that you can't put a tape measure to, we generally see construct validity being established. So if we want to establish that our measure behaves like we would expect it to, that's construct validity. Two ways that are frequently used to do this. One is, does our measure give different values for different groups of people? That's the known groups approach. The other way is if we've got a similar measure, so another measure of quality of life, another measure of pain, does our measure give similar values? That's convergent validity, which is a type of construct validity. If we do have the gold standard, we can try to establish criterion validity. If we want to know whether our measure matches up with a gold standard at the same time, that's concurrent validity. If we're interested in, does our measure predict some future value for the gold standard, that's predictive validity. this is just another view of how these things are distinguished. So criterion validity is often referred to as either concurrent or predictive validity, depending on whether your gold standard is measuring at the same time or at some future date. Construct validity is established with things like known groups, convergent validity, divergent validity, occasionally something called factor analysis, or hypothesis testing. Bottom line, face validity and content validity really aren't enough. What you really want is criterion validity. There's some gold standard, and this outcome measure is highly correlated with it. But often in occupational therapy, we have to settle for construct validity because the things we're measuring don't have a gold standard.